They were told the Americans would do unspeakable things to them. They were told that capture meant torture, shame, and death. But when 47 Japanese women stepped off a rusted military transport ship in San Francisco Harbor in March of 1945, the enemy broke them not with violence or cruelty, but with a pair of hair clippers and a bar of white soap. For 18 months, these women had lived with lice crawling through their matted hair, their scalps raw and bleeding from constant scratching. They expected the Americans to mock them, to parade their suffering for cameras. Instead, a young army nurse looked at one trembling woman, smiled gently, and said 5 words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "We're going to help you." If you find stories like this powerful, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold accounts from World War II history. Now let us return to that foggy morning in San Francisco, where everything these women believed was about to be shattered. The fog rolled thick across the bay that March morning, swallowing the tops of buildings and muffling the sounds of the busy port. The transport ship had crossed the Pacific in 16 days, and the women aboard had spent most of that journey in the lower decks, packed into spaces never designed for human comfort. They were nurses, teachers, radio operators, and clerks who had served the Japanese military in various capacities across the Pacific Islands. Some had been captured in the Philippines, others in Saipan, and a handful from smaller outposts that had fallen one by one as American forces pushed westward. Now they stood on deck, shivering in their tattered uniforms, watching the American coastline emerge from the gray mist like a ghost. Keiko Tanaka was 23 years old. She had been a military nurse stationed in Manila when the city fell. For 18 months, she had been moved from camp to camp, each one worse than the last. Her uniform, once crisp and white, was now a patchwork of stains and patches. Her hair, which she had once worn in neat braids, hung in matted clumps against her thin shoulders. She could feel the lice moving beneath the tangles, a sensation so constant that she had almost stopped noticing it. Almost. Her hands, scarred from months of forced labor, gripped the ship's railing as she stared at America. This was the land of the enemy. This was where, according to everything she had been taught, her suffering would reach its final chapter. The other women clustered together like frightened birds. Some were barely 18, girls who had volunteered for service with dreams of honor and adventure. Now their eyes were hollow, their cheeks sunken, their bodies marked by malnutrition and disease. One woman coughed constantly, a wet rattling sound that spoke of lungs damaged by months in damp cells. Another walked with a limp from a wound that had never properly healed. They had been enemies of America, servants, of an empire that had attacked Pearl Harbor and waged brutal war across the Pacific. They expected to be treated accordingly. The ship's horn sounded, low and mournful, as they approached the dock. The smell hit them first. It was not the smell of death or decay that they had grown accustomed to in the camps. It was something else entirely, something that made their empty stomachs clench with a hunger they had almost forgotten. Coffee, fresh bread, frying meat. The aromas drifted across the water from the port facilities, carried on the morning breeze like whispers of another world. Keiko inhaled deeply, her eyes closing involuntarily. She had not smelled real food in so long that her mind struggled to identify each scent. Behind her, someone whimpered softly. Another woman began to cry, silent tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. The smell of American abundance was the first assault on everything they had been told. The sounds came next. English commands barked from the dock, but they were not the harsh, threatening tones the women had expected. There was order here, yes, but also something that sounded almost like routine efficiency. Trucks rumbled, men shouted to each other in words the women could not understand. Somewhere improbably, someone was laughing. The women exchanged glances, their eyes asking questions none of them could answer. Where were the guns pointed at their heads? Where were the soldiers with bayonets ready to prod them forward like cattle? Instead, they saw American servicemen moving about their duties, barely glancing at the ship. It was as if the arrival of 47 enemy prisoners was simply another task in a busy day. When the gangway lowered and they were ordered to disembark, Keiko's legs trembled so badly she feared they would give out. She descended slowly, one hand on the rope railing, the other clutching a small cloth bag that contained everything she still possessed in the world. A photograph of her parents, a wooden comb with half its teeth missing, and a small journal she had managed to hide throughout her captivity. Her feet touched American soil, and she waited for something terrible to happen. A blow. A shout. Something. Instead, a young woman in an army nurse's uniform approached her with a clipboard. The American looked at Keiko's matted hair, her skeletal frame, her raw and bleeding scalp visible through the tangles, and then inexplicably the American's eyes filled with something that looked like compassion. "Welcome to the United States," the nurse said, her voice soft. "My name is Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. We're going to take care of you now." Keiko did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the same tone she had once used with frightened patients back in Manila, back when she had been a nurse instead of a prisoner. The cognitive dissonance was so profound that she felt dizzy. This was wrong. This was not how enemies behaved. Lieutenant Mitchell made a note. What was a Bilber on her clipboard and gestured for Keiko to follow. Around her, other American personnel were guiding the Japanese women toward a row of waiting buses. There were no chains, no ropes, no guards pointing weapons at their backs. The women moved in stunned silence, their eyes darting everywhere, waiting for the trap to spring. "They will separate us," whispered Yuki, a former radio operator who had been Keiko's companion through the worst of the camps. Her voice was hoarse from months of illness. "They will take us to different places and interrogate us. This kindness is a trick." Keiko nodded, wanting to believe her friend was right because the alternative was too confusing to accept. They had been trained to expect cruelty from Americans. Every piece of propaganda, every military briefing, every whispered rumor had painted the enemy as monsters. To discover they were something else entirely would mean questioning everything they had believed. And that was a door Keiko was not yet ready to open. The buses were clean. That detail struck Keiko more forcefully than anything else that morning. The seats were worn but intact. The windows were whole. There was no smell of human waste or rotting food. As she took her seat, her body sinking into cushions that felt impossibly soft after months of sleeping on bare floors, she noticed something else. The driver, a young American soldier with red hair and freckles, glanced at her in the rearview mirror and nodded. It was a small gesture, almost nothing. But it was acknowledgement, it was recognition of her humanity, and it unsettled her more than any act of violence could have. The buses carried them through streets that seemed to belong to a different planet. Buildings stood intact, their windows gleaming in the pale sunlight that had begun to break through the fog. Shops displayed goods behind clean glass. People walked on sidewalks, carrying packages and briefcases, going about their ordinary lives as if there were no war at all. Keiko pressed her face to the window like a child, unable to look away. In Japan, the cities were being bombed. Her mother's last letter, received over a year ago, had described food shortages, blackouts, constant fear. Here cars filled the streets, here people smiled, here the war seemed like something happening far, far away. The facility they arrived at was on the outskirts of the city, a collection of low buildings surrounded by a wire fence, but even this was different from what they had expected. The buildings were painted, the grounds were maintained. There were flowers growing in beds near the entrance, bright spots of color that seemed almost offensive in their cheerfulness. Guards stood at the gate, but they did not leer or threaten. They simply checked paperwork and waved the buses through. One guard, Keiko noticed, was chewing gum. He blew a small bubble as they passed, then grinned at his own foolishness. She had never seen a soldier do anything so casual, so human, while on duty. Inside the main building, the women were divided into groups of 8. Keiko found herself with Yuki and 6 others she did not know well, strangers united only by their shared captivity. They were led down a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and something else. Something floral that Keiko eventually identified as soap. Real soap, not the harsh lye blocks they had been given in the camps, but actual scented soap. A door opened and they were ushered into a room filled with steam. Tiled walls, shower heads, benches lined with clean towels. A Japanese-American woman in a medical uniform stepped forward, her face kind but professional. "My name is Dr. Yamamoto," she said in perfect Japanese. "I'm going to explain what happens next. Please do not be afraid." Dr. Yamamoto's presence was itself a shock. A Japanese face speaking with American authority, wearing an American uniform, treating Japanese prisoners with Japanese courtesy. The women stared at her as if she were an apparition. "You have all been through terrible experiences," Dr. Yamamoto continued. "We can see that you are suffering from malnutrition, various infections, and severe infestations of lice. Our first priority is to address the lice. This will require us to cut your hair very short. For some of you, we may need to shave your heads completely. I know this is difficult. In Japanese culture, a woman's hair is precious, but the lice have burrowed too deeply. There is no other way." The room fell silent. Several women touched their matted hair instinctively, protectively. In Japan, a shaved head on a woman was a mark of shame, of punishment. It was what happened to adulteresses and criminals. To have their heads shaved by Americans, by the enemy, felt like the ultimate humiliation they had been warned about. Keiko felt tears burning in her eyes. So this was the cruelty, she thought. Not beatings, not torture, but this careful, methodical stripping of their dignity. She braced herself for rough hands, for mocking laughter, for the cold efficiency of hatred. But that was not what happened. Lieutenant Mitchell, the nurse from the dock, entered the room carrying a basket. She set it down on a bench and began removing items one by one. Soft towels, bars of soap in paper wrappers, small bottles of something that smelled like medicine, combs not for their hair but for later, for after. And then she pulled out something that made several women gasp. Cotton robes, white and clean, folded neatly. "These are for you to wear afterward," Lieutenant Mitchell said through Dr. Yamamoto's translation. "We want you to be comfortable. We want you to feel clean. I know you are scared. I would be scared too. But I promise you, we are not here to hurt you. We are here to help you heal." The shaving began with the most severely infested women. Keiko watched as a young army nurse guided one of her companions to a chair. The Japanese woman was trembling so violently that the chair shook. But the American nurse moved slowly, gently, explaining each action through Dr. Yamamoto, even though the prisoner probably could not process the words. The electric clippers hummed to life, and the first clump of matted hair fell to the floor. With it fell dozens of lice, visible even from across the room, tiny dark specks that scattered across the white tiles. The Japanese woman let out a sob, but the American nurse simply paused, placed a hand on her shoulder, and waited until the trembling subsided before continuing. When it was Keiko's turn, she sat in the chair with her eyes closed, her hands clenched in her lap. She felt the nurse's fingers in her hair, gentle despite the tangles, assessing the damage. "It's very bad," she heard the nurse say to someone else. "We'll need to take it all." Keiko understood enough English to grasp the meaning. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, determined not to cry. But when the clippers touched her scalp, when she felt the first lock of hair fall away, something broke inside her. Not from shame or humiliation, but from relief. The lice had tormented her for 18 months. 18 months of constant itching, of scratching until she bled, of feeling things crawling across her skin in the darkness. And now, with each pass of the clippers, they were being removed. The nurse worked methodically, carefully, as if Keiko's comfort mattered. When a tangle proved too stubborn, she did not yank or pull. She applied something from a bottle, waited for it to soften the knot, then tried again. When the clippers nicked Keiko's scalp, the nurse stopped immediately, cleaned the small cut, applied a bandage, and apologized. The enemy had apologized for causing her minor pain. Keiko opened her eyes and looked at the American woman. She was young, perhaps the same age as Keiko herself. Her eyes were blue, a color Keiko had rarely seen before. And those eyes held no hatred, no contempt. Only focus and something that might have been pity, but not the cruel pity of the victorious. It was the pity of one human being for another's suffering. When the shaving was complete, Keiko raised a hand to her head. Her fingers found smooth skin where tangled hair had been. She felt naked, exposed, but also strangely light. The constant crawling sensation was gone. For the first time in 18 months, nothing was moving on her scalp. The nurse held up a mirror, and Keiko saw herself. A stranger stared back. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, a bald head that emphasized how thin she had become, but the reflection was also clean. The face in the mirror was no longer the face of a suffering animal. It was the face of a woman who might perhaps survive. After the shaving came the showers. Real showers with hot water that seemed to pour endlessly from the ceiling. Keiko stood under the stream and let it wash over her, not caring that others could see her skeletal body, not caring about anything except the miraculous warmth. She had not felt truly warm in so long. The camps had been cold, always cold, even in climates that should have been tropical. Cold from malnutrition, cold from fear, cold from the certainty that each day might be her last. But here, in this enemy facility, hot water cascaded over her skin, and she was warm. The soap was white and smooth and smelled like flowers. Keiko held the bar in her hands for a long moment, just feeling its weight, its cleanness. Then she began to wash. The water running off her body was gray at first, then brown, carrying away months of accumulated grime. She scrubbed her arms, her legs, her newly bare scalp. She scrubbed until her skin was red, until she had used half the bar of soap, until she felt like a different person. Around her, other women were doing the same, some crying, some laughing, some simply standing in silence as the water performed its miracle. Yuki caught Keiko's eye and smiled, the first real smile Keiko had seen from her friend in months. No words were needed. The soap and water said everything. After the showers, they were given the clean cotton robes and led to a medical examination room. American doctors checked their eyes, their hearts, their lungs. They noted the malnutrition, the infections, the scars. They asked questions through Dr. Yamamoto about symptoms and pain. And then, incredibly, they provided treatment. Antibiotics for infections, vitamins for deficiencies, ointments for skin conditions. Each woman received a small bag of medications with instructions translated into Japanese. Keiko held her bag and stared at it. In the camps, medicine had been almost non-existent. Women had died from infections that could have been easily treated. Now the enemy was handing out pills and creams as if health were something everyone deserved. But the true shock came in the mess hall. The women were led into a large room filled with tables and chairs, and the smell that greeted them was so overwhelming that several stumbled. Keiko's empty stomach cramped painfully, her body responding to the promise of food with desperate urgency. They were guided to a serving line where American cooks stood behind steaming trays. The cook smiled at them. Smiled. One woman, plump and grandmotherly, said something in English and gestured encouragingly for them to take plates. Dr. Yamamoto translated. She says to take as much as you want. There's plenty. The food was like nothing Keiko had seen in nearly 2 years. White rice, fluffy and perfectly cooked, sliced meat in rich brown gravy. Vegetables that were green and fresh, not the withered scraps they had fought over in the camps. Bread rolls, soft and warm, with actual butter. And fruit. Fruit. Keiko stared at a bowl of sliced peaches and syrup and felt tears streaming down her face. She had dreamed of peaches. In her hunger, in her desperation, she had dreamed of the peaches that grew in her grandmother's garden in Osaka. And here they were, offered freely by the enemy. She took a plate and moved through the line in a daze. Her hands shook so badly that a cook had to help her serve the rice. Another cook added extra meat to her plate, nodding encouragingly. When she reached the end of the line, her plate was piled high with more food than she had eaten in a week at the camps. She found a seat at a table where Yuki and several others had already gathered. For a long moment, no one ate. They simply stared at the abundance before them, unable to believe it was real. Then one woman, the youngest among them, picked up her fork and took a bite of meat. Her eyes widened. She chewed slowly, reverently, as if performing a sacred ritual. And then she began to cry. The crying spread like a wave. One by one, the women broke down as they ate, tears mixing with the food they shoveled into their mouths. They cried from relief. They cried from confusion. They cried because the food was good and plentiful and freely given, and nothing in their experience had prepared them for such treatment from an enemy. Keiko ate through her tears, barely tasting the individual flavors, only aware of the sensation of her stomach filling, of warmth spreading through her body, of strength slowly returning. She ate until her plate was clean, and then a cook appeared and offered her more. More. As if there were no end to what the Americans would give. That night, Keiko wrote in her journal for the first time in months. Her hand was unsteady, her thoughts scattered, but she needed to record what had happened. "Today they shaved my head," she wrote. "I expected shame. Instead, I felt free. They gave us soap and hot water and clean clothes. They gave us medicine for our sickness. They gave us food until we could eat no more. I do not understand this. We are their enemies. We attacked their country. Our soldiers killed their soldiers. Yet they treat us as if we are worthy of care. Either everything I was taught is wrong, or this kindness is the cruelest trick of all. I do not know which possibility frightens me more." The barracks they were assigned to were simple but clean. Each woman received a bed with a mattress, real sheets, and 2 wool blankets. After months of sleeping on bare concrete or wooden planks, the softness of the mattress felt almost obscene. Keiko lay down and felt her body sink into the surface, cradled by something other than hard ground for the first time in so long that she had forgotten the sensation existed. She pulled the blankets up to her chin and breathed in their clean scent. Outside, night had fallen over the American camp, and the sounds of the facility settled into quiet routine. Footsteps of guards passing by, the distant hum of generators. Somewhere a radio played music, faint but unmistakable. American music. A woman's voice singing about love and loss. The other women settled into their beds around her, their newly bare heads resting on actual pillows. Some whispered to each other in the darkness. Others lay in silence, perhaps too overwhelmed to speak. Yuki's bed was next to Keiko's, and in the dim light that filtered through the windows, Keiko could see her friend staring at the ceiling. "Yuki," she whispered, "are you awake?" "I cannot sleep," Yuki replied. "Every time I close my eyes, I expect to wake up back in the camp. I expect this to be a dream." Keiko understood. The comfort felt dangerous, like a trap waiting to spring. But as the hours passed and nothing terrible happened, exhaustion won its battle with fear, and she slept more deeply than she had in 18 months. The days that followed established a rhythm that the women slowly learned to trust. Wake-up was announced by a gentle bell, not the harsh shouts they were accustomed to. Breakfast was served in the mess hall, and each morning brought new wonders: eggs cooked to order, bacon strips crispy with fat, toast with jam and butter, orange juice that tasted like liquid sunshine. The women were assigned light duties, nothing strenuous, nothing punitive. Some worked in the camp laundry, washing sheets and towels. Others helped in the kitchens, peeling vegetables and washing dishes. A few, including Keiko, were assigned to the medical building, where their nursing experience was put to use sorting supplies and preparing treatment rooms. For this work, they were paid. Not much by American standards, but to women who had labored for nothing under brutal conditions, any payment was astonishing. The camp scrip they received could be used at a small canteen that sold items the women had forgotten existed. Chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper, cigarettes for those who smoked, pencils and writing paper, small mirrors, hair ribbons for when their hair grew back. Keiko saved her first week's wages and bought a new journal, her old one nearly full. She also bought a chocolate bar, her first in over 2 years. She ate it slowly, one small square at a time, letting each piece melt on her tongue. The sweetness was so intense it almost hurt. The physical changes came quickly. With regular meals and medical care, the women's bodies began to recover. Cheeks that had been hollow started to fill. Eyes that had been dull regained some sparkle. Hair began to grow back, thin at first, then thicker. Keiko watched her reflection in her small mirror each morning, tracking the transformation. The skull-like face was slowly becoming human again. The bones that had jutted through her skin were gradually covered with flesh. She was still thin, still marked by her ordeal, but she was no longer dying. The enemy, she realized, was making her healthy. They were giving her back her body, her strength, her life. The contradiction gnawed at her constantly. At night, she would lie in her comfortable bed, her stomach full, her skin clean, and she would think about her family in Japan. What were they eating tonight? Were they warm? Were they safe? Letters from home were rare and heavily censored, but the ones that arrived painted pictures of increasing hardship. Her mother wrote of stretching rice with sawdust, of eating wild plants gathered from the hills, of watching neighbors grow thin and sickly. "The war goes badly," her mother wrote in one letter, the words barely legible from the censor's heavy black marks. "But we endure. We must endure." Keiko read those words and felt guilt settle into her bones like a poison. She was the enemy's prisoner, and she was eating better than her own mother. The guilt became a constant companion, as present as the food and the clean sheets and the kindness of the American staff. Keiko saw it in the other women too, a shadow that passed over their faces when the meals were served, when the doctors checked their improving health, when they received their small wages for easy work. They were being treated well, and that treatment felt like betrayal. The Empire had asked for their service, had sent them across the Pacific to support the war effort, and now here they were, growing fat on enemy food while Japan starved. Some women refused second helpings, punishing themselves for the crime of survival. Others ate everything offered and then wept in their bunks, torn between their body's needs and their heart's loyalties. The American abundance extended beyond the camp's fences. Sometimes for work details or medical appointments, the women were transported through nearby towns. These journeys became exercises in disbelief. Shops displayed goods that had vanished from Japanese markets years ago. Children played in parks, their cheeks round with good nutrition. Gas stations pumped fuel for civilian cars as if petroleum were unlimited. Movie theaters advertised new films. Restaurants advertised meals. Life continued in America as if the war were a minor inconvenience happening somewhere far away. The women would press their faces to the bus windows and stare at this impossible world, this land of the enemy that seemed more like paradise than purgatory. One afternoon, Keiko's work detail was sent to help sort medical supplies at a local hospital. The building was enormous, gleaming with modern equipment that seemed to belong to the future. Doctors and nurses moved through corridors with purpose and confidence. Patients lay in clean beds in private rooms, attended by staff who seemed to have unlimited resources. Keiko worked alongside an American nurse named Betty, a cheerful woman from Ohio who chatted constantly despite the language barrier. Betty showed Keiko photographs of her family, her husband, her 2 children, her house with a white fence and a garden. "After the war," Betty said, pointing at herself and then at Keiko, "peace. Friends." She smiled and mimed shaking hands. Keiko nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The idea of peace, of friendship with these people, was too strange to process. The guards at the camp were mostly young men, some barely older than teenagers. They had been assigned to prisoner duty rather than combat, and many seemed uncertain how to treat their charges. The Japanese women were not the savage enemy they had been taught to expect. They were thin, quiet, polite to the point of deference, clearly traumatized by their experiences. The guards watched them with curiosity rather than hatred. Some made small gestures of kindness. A piece of gum slipped through the fence, a wave and a smile during morning roll call, a moment of patience when communication failed. These gestures accumulated like drops of water, slowly wearing away at the stone of the women's fear. One guard in particular seemed drawn to Keiko. His name was Private James Walker, and he was 19 years old, from a small town in Kansas that Keiko had never heard of. He had red hair and freckles and a gap between his front teeth that showed when he smiled, which was often. He was assigned to the medical building where Keiko worked, and he would find excuses to be near her, asking questions she could barely understand, pointing at objects and saying their English names. "Bandage," he would say, holding up a roll of gauze. "Medicine," pointing at a bottle of pills. "You," pointing at Keiko. "Learn English. Good. Important." His earnestness was so genuine that Keiko found herself trying to learn, repeating the words back to him, watching his face light up when she got them right. James brought her things. Small things at first, a stick of gum, a pencil, a magazine with pictures of American movie stars, then larger things, a dictionary, Japanese English, worn but functional, a photograph of his family's farm, flat fields stretching to the horizon under a huge sky. "Kansas," he said, pointing at the photo. "Home. After war, you visit. See America. Real America, not camp." Keiko accepted these gifts with the elaborate politeness drilled into her from childhood, bowing slightly each time, murmuring thanks in her limited English. She did not know what to make of James Walker. He was the enemy. His country's bombs were falling on her homeland, yet he treated her with a warmth that seemed utterly sincere. The other women noticed, of course. Some warned Keiko to be careful, convinced that James's kindness was a ploy to extract information or secure some other advantage. Others were simply jealous, wishing they had someone paying them such attention. Yuki, always practical, suggested that Keiko use James to learn English faster, the better to understand what the Americans were planning. Knowledge is survival, Yuki said. Use every tool available. So Keiko studied with the dictionary James had given her, memorizing words and phrases, practicing with him when their paths crossed. Her English improved rapidly, and with it came something unexpected: conversation. Actual conversation with an enemy soldier who talked about his mother's apple pie, his father's wheat fields, his dream of becoming a teacher after the war. He was not a monster. He was a boy far from home, doing a job he had not chosen, trying to be decent in indecent times. The irony was unbearable. Keiko would lie awake at night, thinking about James, about Betty, about the cooks who smiled and the doctors who healed and the guards who waved. She thought about the propaganda she had absorbed so completely, the images of American savagery, the warnings of torture and abuse. None of it matched what she was experiencing. Either the propaganda had been lies, or this camp was an elaborate deception. The second option grew less convincing with each passing day. What would be the point of such deception? The women had no valuable information. They posed no threat. They were simply prisoners, beneath notice, unworthy of such elaborate manipulation. Which left the first option: the lies. The possibility that everything she had believed about the enemy was wrong. The internal conflict deepened as spring turned to summer and the women's health continued to improve. Keiko's hair grew back, covering her scalp in soft dark fuzz that would eventually become thick enough to style. Her body filled out, curves returning where bones had jutted. She had energy now, strength she had forgotten she possessed. She could walk across the camp without stopping to rest. She could work a full day without collapsing from exhaustion. The enemy had done this. The enemy had restored her body, and now that body felt like a traitor. Memory collided with reality in painful ways. Keiko would remember the camps, the real camps, the ones run by her own side. She had been transferred through several during her captivity, and in each one she had witnessed the treatment of prisoners. American prisoners, British prisoners, Australian prisoners. She had seen them beaten, starved, worked to death. She had heard their screams and done nothing because doing something meant joining them. She had told herself that the enemy deserved such treatment, that they were less than human, that Japan was fighting for survival against Western aggression. Now, eating American food and sleeping in American beds, she could no longer believe those justifications. If the Americans could treat their enemies with dignity, why couldn't Japan? The question haunted her. It crept into her prayers, her dreams, her waking thoughts. She tried to push it away, to focus on survival, on getting through each day. But it would not be silenced. Other women were wrestling with similar doubts. Keiko heard them whispering in the barracks at night, voices tight with confusion and shame. "Perhaps we were wrong," one woman said, her words barely audible. "Perhaps we were the monsters all along." The statement hung in the darkness unanswered because to answer it would be to acknowledge a truth too devastating to accept. Keiko sought refuge in her journal, pouring out thoughts she could not speak aloud. "I was taught that America was evil," she wrote. "I was taught that Americans were savages who would brutalize us without mercy. But they have given me soap and food and medicine. They have given me dignity when I expected degradation. Private Walker teaches me English words and shows me photographs of his home. The nurses treat my illness with genuine concern. Either I am experiencing an elaborate deception, or everything I believed is false. If it is false, then what does that make me? What does it make my country? What does it make the war itself? I am afraid to answer these questions. I am afraid of what the answers might reveal." The collective wrestling happened in stages, like a fever breaking slowly rather than all at once. It started with small admissions, whispered confessions between friends in the hours after lights out. Women would share their doubts, testing the waters, seeing if they were alone in their confusion. They were not. As the months passed and the good treatment continued without pause, a consensus began to form, unspoken but understood. Something was wrong with what they had been taught. Something fundamental had been false. Different women responded differently to this realization. Some retreated further into denial, insisting that the American kindness was a sophisticated form of propaganda, a trick to weaken their resolve before the real cruelty began. These women kept to themselves, maintained their distance from the American staff, accepted the food and care with cold formality that protected them from gratitude. Others embraced the new reality with desperate enthusiasm, learning English, befriending guards, speaking openly about how wrong Japan had been. These women were viewed with suspicion by both groups, seen as either traitors or fools. Most, like Keiko, occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. They could not deny what they were experiencing, but they could not fully accept it either. They lived in a state of suspended judgment, grateful for the good treatment, but unwilling to draw larger conclusions. They told themselves that perhaps this camp was an exception, that perhaps other prisoners elsewhere were suffering as expected. They told themselves that kindness from individuals did not erase the larger evil of American imperialism. They told themselves many things, constructing bridges between their old beliefs and their new experiences. bridges that grew increasingly unstable as evidence mounted. The generational divide was significant. Older women, those who had served longest and been most thoroughly indoctrinated, resisted change most strongly. They had built their identities around service to the empire, around certainty about Japan's righteousness. To abandon those beliefs was to abandon themselves. Younger women, those who had been swept into the war before their beliefs had fully solidified, were more willing to question. They had less invested in the old narratives, less to lose from admitting error. Keiko, at 23, fell somewhere in between. She had believed deeply, served faithfully, but she was still young enough for those beliefs to bend rather than break. Secret confessions became a ritual. Women would find quiet corners of the camp, pairs or small groups, and speak truths they dared not acknowledge publicly. "I saw what we did to their prisoners," one woman admitted, her voice trembling. "I saw the camps in the Philippines. What we did? It was not what warriors do. It was what monsters do." Another woman nodded, her eyes wet. "My brother wrote to me from China. He described things I cannot repeat. I burned the letter, but I cannot burn the memory. We were told we were liberators. We were not." These confessions bound the women together in a web of shared guilt and dawning understanding. They were not innocent. Their nation was not innocent. And the enemy they had been taught to hate was treating them with a mercy they had never extended in return. The deeper recognition came slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape the women had never seen before. It was not just that the Americans were kind. It was that their kindness seemed to flow from something larger, something systemic rather than individual. The camp followed rules. The food and medicine were not gifts from generous captors, but entitlements under international law. The Geneva Convention, that strange document the women had heard mentioned but never understood, apparently guaranteed certain standards of treatment for prisoners of war. The Americans were not being kind because they chose to be. They were being kind because they believed prisoners deserved kindness as a matter of right. This concept was revolutionary. In the world Keiko had known, treatment depended on power and mercy. Those with power could treat those without power however they wished. Mercy was a gift, not a right, and gifts could be withdrawn at any moment. But here was a different philosophy, one that suggested human beings had inherent worth regardless of their nationality or status. Prisoners were still people. Enemies were still human. Even those who had attacked and killed American soldiers deserved food, shelter, medical care, and dignity. Keiko turned this idea over in her mind like a strange artifact, unable to fully grasp it, but unable to look away. The education programs reinforced this impression. The camp offered classes in English, American history, and civics. Attendance was voluntary, but Keiko went, driven by curiosity and her growing facility with the language. She learned about democracy, about rights, about a system of government where power flowed from the people rather than the emperor. She learned about the American Revolution, about people who had fought their own king for the right to rule themselves. She learned about the Constitution, about checks and balances, about the idea that even the most powerful leaders were bound by law. It was disorienting, like discovering that the earth was round after spending your life believing it flat. The world was not what she had been taught. America was not what she had been taught. Perhaps nothing was. The films were even more confusing. The camp had a small theater where American movies were shown on weekend evenings. Keiko attended with Yuki, both of them curious about this strange form of entertainment. They saw comedies about ordinary Americans falling in love, dramas about families overcoming hardship, musicals about dancers and singers pursuing dreams. The people in these films were not monsters. They were recognizable, relatable, even likable. They worried about money and romance and the future. They laughed at jokes and cried at losses. They were, undeniably, human beings. And if the enemy was human, if they could create art and beauty and laughter, then the war itself took on a different character. It was not a struggle between good and evil, between civilization and barbarism. It was something more complicated, more tragic, more difficult to justify. The most dangerous weapon, Keiko realized, was not the bombs or the guns or the ships. It was this: the soap and the food and the films. The kindness that demanded nothing in return. The dignity that was given freely, as if all human beings deserved it simply by virtue of being human. These weapons destroyed not bodies but beliefs. They did not kill but converted. And their effects were far more lasting than any physical wound. A woman might recover from a beating and emerge with her hatred intact. But how could she recover from being treated with respect? How could she maintain her contempt for an enemy who refused to be contemptible? The turning point came on an August morning, hot and bright, when the camp received word that something terrible had happened in Japan. The guards grew somber. The American staff spoke in low voices. Dr. Yamamoto gathered the Japanese women in the mess hall and told them, her face pale, that a bomb of unprecedented power had been dropped on the city of Hiroshima. The details were unclear, but the destruction was said to be absolute. Tens of thousands dead. An entire city gone in a flash of light. Keiko heard the words without understanding them. Hiroshima. She had cousins in Hiroshima, an aunt who made beautiful pottery, a temple she had visited as a child. Gone? How could a city be gone? Around her, women were wailing, collapsing, calling out names of loved ones who might have been there. Yuki grabbed Keiko's arm so hard it left bruises. "It cannot be true," Yuki said, her voice high with denial. "No bomb could destroy a city. It must be propaganda. American lies." But Dr. Yamamoto's face said otherwise. And 3 days later, when word came of a second bomb dropped on Nagasaki, the lies theory became impossible to maintain. In the days that followed, something shattered inside Keiko. It was not just grief for the dead, though she grieved. It was not just fear for her family, though she feared. It was something larger, something fundamental. The empire she had served, the nation she had believed in, the war she had supported, all of it had led to this. 2 cities erased, hundreds of thousands dead. And for what? For glory? For territory? For an emperor who claimed divinity while his people starved? She thought about the prisoners she had seen in the camps, the Americans and British and Australians who had been beaten and starved and worked to death. She thought about the women here, treated with dignity by the very enemy Japan had brutalized. She thought about Private Walker teaching her English words, about Betty showing her photographs of home. And she thought about the mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima, over Nagasaki, over everything she had believed. She went to the small mirror in the barracks and looked at her reflection. Her hair had grown back, short but thick. Her face had filled out, no longer skeletal. She was healthy, alive, recovering, while cities burned and people died. "Who am I?" she asked her reflection. The woman in the mirror had no answer. She was not the nurse who had gone to Manila with certainty in her heart. She was not the prisoner who had arrived expecting torture. She was someone new, someone still forming, someone who had been broken down to nothing and was being rebuilt from parts that did not quite fit together. The old Keiko was dead. The new Keiko did not yet exist. There was only this moment, this mirror, this face that was hers and yet strange. The announcement of Japan's surrender came on August 15th. The women gathered around a radio, listening to the emperor's voice for the first time in their lives. He spoke in archaic Japanese, his words formal and indirect. But the meaning was clear. The war was over. Japan had lost. The divine wind had not blown. The enemy had won. Some women knelt and wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few refused to believe, insisting it was a trick, a false broadcast, anything but the truth. Keiko listened to the emperor's voice and felt nothing. She had expected despair, shame, rage. Instead, there was only emptiness, a vast hollow space where her beliefs had once lived. The war was over. Japan had lost. And she was alive in an American camp, treated with kindness by enemies who had somehow become the only people keeping her from starvation. The months after the surrender were strange ones. The women remained in the camp while arrangements were made for their repatriation. Some were eager to go home, desperate to find out if their families had survived. Others dreaded the return, knowing that Japan lay in ruins and that life there would be harder than anything they had faced in captivity. Keiko fell into the second category. She wrote to her family but received no reply. She did not know if they were alive or dead, if their home still stood, if there was anything left to return to. The uncertainty was torture of a different kind, a slow bleeding of hope that no American kindness could stanch. Private Walker found her one evening, sitting alone on a bench behind the medical building, watching the sun set over the California hills. He sat down beside her without speaking, and for a long time they simply watched the sky change colors together. "You scared?" he finally asked, his English slower and clearer than usual, the way he spoke when he wanted her to understand. "Go home, you scared?" Keiko nodded, not trusting her voice. "Me too," James said. "War over, but I scared. Different world now. Everything different." He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a brooch, shaped like a flower, simple but pretty. "For you," he said. "Remember America. Remember not all enemy. Remember James." Keiko took the brooch with trembling fingers. She wanted to say something profound, something that would capture everything she had learned and felt during her months in this impossible place. Instead, she said simply, "Thank you. I remember." The ship that took her home was crowded with returning prisoners and soldiers, all of them thin and haunted, all of them carrying invisible weights. Keiko stood on deck as the Japanese coastline appeared, the mountains rising green against the gray sky. But as they drew closer, the green gave way to gray. Bombed buildings, burned forests, harbors choked with the wreckage of ships. Japan had been devastated far more completely than she had imagined. The newspaper reports and censored letters had not prepared her for this. Nothing could have prepared her for this. Her hometown was gone. Not damaged, not struggling, but simply gone. Where streets and houses had stood, there was only rubble and char. She wandered through the ruins like a ghost, searching for landmarks she remembered, finding nothing. The temple where she had prayed as a child was a pile of stones. The school where she had learned to read was a crater. Her family home was ash. She stood in what had been the garden and wept, mourning not just the place, but everything it represented. Childhood, innocence, certainty, home. Her family miraculously had survived. She found them in a refugee camp outside the city, living in a tent with 3 other families. Her mother had aged 20 years. Her father walked with a limp from an injury sustained during an air raid. Her younger sister, once so bright and curious, had a dull look in her eyes that spoke of things seen and suffered. They embraced Keiko with desperate joy, but when they learned where she had been held, when she told them about the food and the medicine and the soap, something changed. Her mother's embrace grew stiff. Her father looked away. Her sister whispered, "You were comfortable while we starved?" The guilt that Keiko had carried all through her captivity crystallized into something sharp and permanent. She had survived. She had even thrived. And her family could not forgive her for it. Years passed. Japan rebuilt. Keiko built a new life, finding work as a nurse in one of the new hospitals, eventually marrying a quiet man who had also served in the war, and understood without needing explanations. She had children, then grandchildren. She watched her country transform from ashes to prosperity, from enemy to ally, from shame to pride. But she never forgot those months in the American camp. She never forgot the soap and the showers and the food. She never forgot Private James Walker and his dictionary and his brooch, which she kept in a small box on her dresser until the day she died. She told her children about the war, but not all of it. Some truths were too heavy for young shoulders. She told them about service and sacrifice, about endurance and survival, but she also told them about kindness from unexpected places, about enemies who were also human beings, about the power of dignity to heal wounds that cruelty could only deepen. Her children grew up with a different view of America than the one Keiko had been taught. They grew up knowing that the world was complicated, that people were complicated, that good and evil were not distributed neatly along national boundaries. When Keiko was 70 years old, she received a letter from Kansas. It was from James Walker's son, who had found Keiko's name in his father's papers after James's death. James had kept letters Keiko had written over the years, occasional notes of thanks and updates on her life. He had told his children about the Japanese nurse he had met during the war, the one who had taught him that enemies were also people. His son wanted Keiko to know that his father had never forgotten her. He had kept her photograph in his wallet until the day he died. Keiko read the letter and wept. She wept for James, for herself, for all the young people who had been swept up in a war not of their making. She wept for the hatred that had been taught and the kindness that had overcome it. And she wept for the simple truth that had taken her whole life to fully accept, that a bar of soap and a warm shower and a meal given freely could change the world more profoundly than any bomb. The Americans had not defeated Japan with weapons alone. They had defeated it with humanity. And that humanity had planted seeds that grew into friendship, into alliance, into a peace that lasted generations. And so the soap became more than soap. The shaved heads became more than hygiene. The meals became more than nutrition. They became proof that even in the darkest times, even between the bitterest enemies, human beings are capable of treating each other with dignity. For those Japanese women who stepped off the ship in San Francisco Harbor expecting torture and finding kindness instead, the memory of clean water and white soap stayed with them forever. It reminded them that the world was not as they had been taught. It reminded them that mercy is sometimes more powerful than cruelty. It reminded them that even enemies can choose to be human. Keiko Tanaka lived to be 92 years old. In her final years, she often told her great-grandchildren about the war, about the camp, about the bar of soap that had changed everything. They could have treated us like animals, she would say, her voice thin with age but clear with conviction. We had treated their soldiers like animals. We expected nothing else. But they gave us soap. They gave us food. They gave us back our dignity. And that kindness was harder to carry than any cruelty would have been. Because cruelty confirms what you believe. Kindness forces you to change. She would pause then, her eyes distant, seeing faces and places long gone. Remember that, she would tell her great-grandchildren. When you have power over someone, when you could choose cruelty without consequence, choose kindness instead. You never know what seeds you might plant. And that is a story worth remembering. In a war filled with horror and hatred, small acts of humanity made differences that lasted generations. The women who arrived as enemies departed as something more complicated, their certainties shattered, their hearts opened, their lives changed by soap and showers and meals given freely. They carried that lesson back to Japan, planted it in their families, watched it grow into understanding. The war ended in 1945, but its lessons continue to speak to us today. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold accounts from World War II history. These stories, buried in time, still have the power to change how we see the world and each other. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, kindness is never wasted, even on an enemy. Especially on an enemy.